Good afternoon and evening to everyone for attending this fourth webinar in our series Adapting to Succeed from EastWest Advisors. And today we're going to be talking about business and investment opportunities between Australia and ASEAN. So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which I am sitting today. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here today, also paying my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'm Michael Moynard. I'm a Director of EastWest Advisors and I'll be your host for this session. And I'd like to thank you for coming and joining us today. We hope you enjoy and gain some insight into the potential two-way trade and investment opportunities between Australia and ASEAN. The special focus today is the consideration of using Singapore as an entry point to ASEAN for Australia, both for Australian companies looking to increase their footprint in ASEAN and for companies within ASEAN to see Singapore as a bridge to Australian markets. So before I start, I'd just like to find out a bit about you, our audience. Over the course of the webinar, we'll be presenting some poll questions to you. I hope that you will take the opportunity of providing us some feedback to these questions. So the first one will appear on your screen now. And we'd like to know what your interest is in regard to this webinar. Are you an exporter, an investor, from government or from another organisation? We'll give you about 20 seconds to answer and please submit your answers now. Okay. And we've got a number of people from the investment community and people from other sectors. So that's an interesting mix of participants. Thank you very much. And I'm sure that will change as we gather our audience today. So in opening this webinar, there really could be no better time to consider ASEAN as a region for Australian business. Our two-way trade with ASEAN is worth $123 billion, or 13.9% of Australia's total trade. Singapore contributes 3.7% of this number. ASEAN accounts for 11.8% of our exports and Singapore 3.4%. ASEAN accounts for $47 billion in inward investment for Australia, almost half of that coming from Singapore. And at the same time, Australia invests around $42 billion in ASEAN economies. These numbers indicate that there is considerable scope to increase our involvement in ASEAN markets. The signing last week of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, between ASEAN countries, Japan, South Korea, China, New Zealand and Australia, has put the spotlight back on ASEAN and North Asia. When it comes into force, the RCEP agreement will complement Australia's existing networks of FTAs in Asia. It also opens a way for India to join this agreement in the future, providing an economic agreement which could unite the major Asian markets in the Indo-Pacific. This will not only provide a single set of rules for preferential tariffs across the area, but expand the opportunities for telecommunications, professional and financial services. And this comes on the heels of the Australia-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement signed in August, which according to DFAT, this will set up digital trade rules and standards with Singapore, which over time can be used as benchmarks for our region. So today we have three excellent speakers who are going to be speaking about Australia, Singapore, and the ASEAN connection. And our first speaker is Phil Forrest. And I'd just like to introduce Phil, Director of the AusCham ASEAN Chamber of Commerce in Singapore. And he has been a board member of AusCham Singapore for almost 20 years and is past president of the Australia-Thai Chamber of Commerce. He's a member of the Governing Council of the Singapore Institute of Directors, fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and of CPA Australia. And he, for 6 years, was a council member of the Singapore Business Federation. Phil has an enormous reach into ASEAN, has been part of that region for many years, and we're very, very pleased to have Phil with us today. So over to you, Phil. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to assume that everyone is somewhat familiar with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, the grouping of 10 countries that lie just to the north of Australia. And this region, with a 650 million population, is the world's 5th largest economy, or it would be if it was one country, with a GDP of about $3 trillion US. And it's been one of the fastest growing regions on the planet, if we put COVID aside for a little while. And I believe, and I strongly believe, that this is the sweet spot for Australian economic opportunity for the next few decades. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So what's happening in ASEAN? Well, first of all, the region's been doing well, not just recently, but ever since ASEAN was formed, initially by 5 countries back in 1967. And as the 2 pictures there suggest, while the agriculture sector is still important to many of the countries in the region, manufacturing, services, and sophisticated cities have emerged throughout the region. Many millions of people living in these 10 countries have been dragged out of poverty, and in a sometimes depressing world, this has been a really good news story. GDP per capita, I don't have the numbers there, but it's gone from $122, and this is in constant current US dollars, $122 back in 1967 to over $4,600 per capita today. With the exception of much of China, I don't think there would be any part of the world that could go near that success. Life expectancy has increased in that time from 56 years to 71 years. And as indicated there, HSBC have great confidence in the region, as I do. GDP has been rising at comfortably above 5% per annum for decades, and right up until COVID hit. We can talk about COVID a little later. So that's not quite as fast as China has been, where maybe 700 million people have been dragged out of poverty and joined the middle class. But it's still one of the fastest growth rates globally. What else is happening? Well, ASEAN is urbanizing at a very fast rate. I love this picture. This is Ho Chi Minh City. We used to call it Saigon back in 1994. And I'm going to show you the same street from the same angle just 20 years later in 2014. I think that's just stunning, but it's so representative of what's been happening in this region. ASEAN is urbanizing at a rate of about 700 people moving to the cities per hour. And that, you know, while that creates congestion, you just think about the traffic in Bangkok or Jakarta, the process of movement from underemployment in the agriculture sector to the cities is a significant driver of economic growth. ANZ says urbanization will be a key engine for the transformation of ASEAN into one of the world's largest and fastest growing economic zones in the coming decades. ASEAN has neighbors with money to invest. Immediately to the north of ASEAN is China. And China is getting expensive to produce things because of its success. And it's pushing manufacturing and supply chains out into neighboring countries, especially into ASEAN. And it's directing a lot of its One Belt, One Road money into the region as well. And Japan and India and the USA and some EU countries are also following suit and investing heavily into this region. And even the spat between the USA and China I'm not suggesting for a moment that this is good news for the world, but it is leading to more aggressive investment by both parties into the region to try to cement their foothold. So it is benefiting the region to some extent. ASEAN has a young population. In Japan, the average age is 47, one of the highest in the world, probably the highest in the world. And that's a problem because more elderly people have to be supported by fewer people of productive age. In the EU, it's 42. In the USA and Australia and China, it's about 38. In ASEAN, it's 28. And in some of the countries, Cambodia, Laos, Philippines, it's under 25. So there's a significant demographic dividend for ASEAN, at least out for the next decade or so. Broadly speaking, Africa too is very young, just by the way. Broadly speaking, economic growth is a function of the number of workers, people of productive age, and their level of productivity. So shifting demographics in part drives economic growth. And that's bad news for Japan, but it's very good news for ASEAN. And the people are getting wealthier. With GDP growth and urbanization, it's leading to a rapidly growing middle class. Of course, it's uneven. Of course, there's still poverty in several of these countries. But if you look at these numbers from the World Bank, now, admittedly, these forecasts were made before COVID, but I think while COVID will delay certain of these results, I don't think it's going to change them in the medium term. And you'll see there that ASEAN is far and away the area of the world where the biggest increase in middle class is going to happen. When I say middle class, I tend to mean people who have moved to the stage where they can buy and want to buy branded goods instead of going down to the market to buy rice wrapped up in newspaper or in a tin cup or whatever. The region is peaceful. And in a way, that's absolutely astonishing because this region was colonized by the Indians, the Chinese, the French, the Brits, the Dutch, the Japanese, Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, and then it was all decolonized. And that's been a recipe for disaster in many parts of the world. Just think of the Balkans, the Middle East, Africa. And yet, since the Vietnam War, this region has been pretty much a haven of peace. Now, I'll leave it to Ben to talk about digital transformation, except to give you this quote from the World Economic Forum. ASEAN is the fastest growing internet market in the world, with 125,000 new users coming onto the internet every day. The numbers from this region are astonishing. So there we go. Does it get any better than this? Well, let's be balanced here. Yes, it could be better. There's still corruption, for example, in some of the countries, and that's a hindrance to even greater success. In some countries, there's dysfunctional politics. There are variable standards of corporate governance. There's inconsistency in the legal systems. There's very creaky infrastructure in just about everywhere except Singapore. But of course, that infrastructure problem is an opportunity to many people. So bottom line, let's be honest, ASEAN can be a bit messy. If you don't have a tolerance for messiness, then maybe this region isn't for you. But hey, if it was easy, everybody would already be there. Remember, for example, that when there's a coup in Thailand, as there pretty regularly is, the politics become exciting, but business just gets on with business. None of the many political parties up there, or the army, or the monarchy, have any interest in getting in the way of the corporate sector. But if you don't like messiness, you can start with Singapore. Corruption-free, outstanding infrastructure, strong governance, rated one of the easiest places in the world to do business. And the Singapore-Australia relationship at so many levels is outstanding. We have a fabulous relationship. So Singapore is the perfect gateway to the rest of ASEAN and the rest of Asia. But wherever you look in ASEAN, there are exciting opportunities for Australia. These are just a few examples. It's not meant to be exhaustive, but because ASEAN is becoming a market for just about everything that Australia does well. And the people of this region like Australians, and they'd welcome more opportunities to do more business with us. For food, think about this. The Chinese are eating 5 times as much meat as they were in the 1980s. And Southeast Asians are following suit as they get wealthier. Middle class Asians are eating more wheat, noodles and bread and so forth instead of rice. And they want more wine made of grapes, not rice. And they want just about every other consumer item too. And as people get wealthier, they want more. And they want it nicely packaged. So Visy, a great Australian company, is up in this region doing very well. Infrastructure, huge infrastructure needs in this region. With 700 people per hour moving into the cities, you can imagine how that is. The Asian Development Bank says the spend on infrastructure in the next 15 years will be about $7 trillion. So they need all the hard commodities that Australia provides, but they also need engineers and architects and urban planners and project managers, financiers and lawyers and so forth. And they need housing and office buildings and warehouses. Lend-Lease has been up in this region for 50 years now, and they're doing very well. They have a great reputation. Education. We all know how Asia wants a lot of Australia's education, but here's an opportunity to perhaps have less reliance on China and more on some other emerging countries. James Cook University has a huge campus here in Singapore. Curtin has a campus here, RMIT in Vietnam, and others throughout the region, but big opportunity. Tourism. As they get wealthier, they want places to visit. And nobody does that better than Australia. And of course, I'm talking post-COVID, but that time will come. And they want professional services and better healthcare and wealth management advice and so forth, and many, many more areas. Now, another reason to pay attention to this region that Mike already touched on is RCEP. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, was signed just last week or 2 weeks ago. And now RCEP was driven, it took about 8 or 9 years to come into being, but it was driven by the 10 ASEAN countries. And it also includes New Zealand, Australia, Japan, China, and South Korea. India dropped out, but we hope they'll return later. This trade agreement, the biggest in the world, covers about 30% of the world's population and just under 30% of the world's GDP. Now, it won't come into force until it's been ratified by at least half of the countries, but I'm sure that's going to happen. That's coming. So, in spite of everything I've said, which I find pretty compelling, it's interesting to note that Australia still invests more in New Zealand every year than in the 10 countries of ASEAN. Now, I know that New Zealand is right on the doorstep, but hey, so is ASEAN. So I'd just say in closing that COVID has given many of us an opportunity to reflect on our strategy and think how business might change in the coming years. And as we do that, I'd urge you to consider looking north to what could be one of the greatest economic opportunities for Australia in the 21st century. And if you think you're too late, well, it is the Asian century, and the good news is it's only 2020, so there's still plenty of time to jump on board. On that note, Mike, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you very much, Phil. That was a fascinating introduction to ASEAN and some of the potential opportunities there. Before we move to our next speaker, we have our second poll question, which is again just finding out a bit about our audience. And the question is, what is your major market of interest? And so it's ASEAN, China, USA, India, or other. So again, give you 20 seconds or so to submit your answer. Thank you. Okay. That is really good. So we've got a lot of people obviously interested in ASEAN at an ASEAN webinar. That's great. But very interesting to see that we also have people interested in China and India. That's really good. Thank you very much for that. So our next speaker is Ben Vella from Telstra. Ben is the head of enterprise customer hub for Singapore. He's had many years of experience in the ASEAN region, and we see his bio there. We're very pleased to be able to have Ben talk to us particularly about opportunities in the digital arena and the Singapore-Australia Digital Economy Agreement. So over to you, Ben. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mike, and thanks to EastWest for inviting me to this opportunity. I feel maybe that question was a bit loaded after Phil's ASEAN presentation, but it's good to see it got through. So everyone's interested in ASEAN now. So well done. So for me, I'm going to speak a bit about a recent agreement that was signed between Australia and Singapore on digital trade, and I think this is a quite exciting agreement as far as it's forming the basis of a new type of trade agreement. And I think Singapore and Australia are in many ways leading the way in the world with this agreement. So if we just trying to click, there we go. If we start to look at what is the purpose of a digital free trade agreement, I think that the focus of this was to ensure that Australian and Singapore businesses can benefit from what are growing opportunities across the digital trade arena. So there's we're seeing an ever greater share of trade actually happen digitally. We're seeing, to Phil's point, Southeast Asia has this growing middle class. We've got young populations and a lot of access to devices and a big growing online community that is growing daily, as Phil sort of mentioned. So Singapore is Australia's largest trade and investment partner in ASEAN, and one of the few countries that Australia actually has a comprehensive strategic partnership with. And the digital economy is starting to form more and more a pillar of that agreement. So the other big thing about this is Singapore is often seen as a gateway into the ASEAN region and community. And part of the goal of this agreement was to look at how can we set a benchmark for the broader ASEAN community and allow that promotion of growth between Australian businesses into the region. And then finally, I think that this is also being used as a benchmark for the work at the WTO negotiations, where both Singapore and Australia sort of joined there. So what we did as part of my role at AusCham in Singapore is we actually went out to and got about 30 industry leaders from across various markets in Singapore, and we brought them together and started to ask, why do you want, what do you need to help promote trade and investment in the Singapore region and the broader ASEAN region? And we came out with about 5 initiatives that were looked at. The first was around digital trade facilitation. So this is really an important part of bringing agricultural goods and other goods into the Singapore and then broader beyond into the ASEAN markets. So simple things about how we get our goods through customs can make a big impact, especially for SMEs who don't have the resources to navigate some of the complex paperwork and legal systems that are often in place in moving goods between different markets. So the idea that if this could be digitized, it would really cut waste for suppliers that are looking to enter this market from Australia, and again promote a lot of efficiencies in being able to distribute products into those markets. The next one was cross-border data flows. So I think one of the big areas that is an issue, and maybe Alan will run into this a bit deeper further on when he speaks about financial startups and the like and fintechs. But one of the big issues for financial services and health is around data privacy rules and data sovereignty rules. So there's a lot of issues around, especially for banks, we need to keep the data local to the country that's in. And that ability to start to recognise data security and privacy across borders really frees up and gives a lot of flexibility to financial institutions and health institutions, again enabling more ability to expand. Cross-border payments are always a big one, and trying to reduce the cost of transfer, taxes, etc., and also things around background checks and the like. Startups were really fed back a lot on around visa options and getting employment recognition and ability to move between different markets. And I think Singapore's been really at the cutting edge of allowing startups to come in. They recently just released a technology visa for for recognised leaders in the technology space, so that they can enter into Singapore. Then we've got sort of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, and there's a lot of argument and questions around this space in not just in the region but globally, and what that'll actually mean for communities, companies, and individuals as well. Digital identity goes through, can we use the identity in one jurisdiction into another versus having to reprove and re-go through that identity area again? So example, a big obstacle can be as simple as opening up a bank account in another another area. And then the final one was just around digital standards and collaboration on research. So to really frame this, I think if you look at the digital space at the moment, you're starting to see some areas of the globe which are actually fragmenting a bit. So you've started, the clearest example of that is China with the Great Firewall that they run, means that they're setting their own rules, their own ways of doing business in the digital area. So it's really agreements like this which allow that start to encourage that common framework and hopefully stop different jurisdictions starting to localize. And I think in places like Australia, Singapore, and even ASEAN, where we're community blocks, being able to work together across digital areas is a real advantage, as the size of the market means it's very difficult to do it just as a individual country. So if we look at the agreement which was signed sort of earlier this year, the big things to come out of it were positively taking and addressing a lot of the feedback that we actually provided into the negotiators. So I think that one of the big ones is around preventing the restrictions of local data, which is really important, as I said, for financial and health institutions. Protection around source code or IP is a big one, so that there doesn't need to be that disclosure around the IP that might make up a product or software or the like. We've seen agreements come through on e-invoicing and e-payment frameworks, which is quite encouraging, and we're also seeing the enhanced enforcement of online consumer protection. So I think trade, we typically think of how can we promote more business, but for many people, it's about how can we protect their environment and their personalities online. And again, this moves into the sort of safe online environment. A very interesting one that's come out is this access to government information, and that getting access to this information can really help companies grow as they can understand the markets that they're going into more clearly as they move forward. And then finally, I think it's about that commitment to just overall transparency between the two markets. So I think what we've seen negotiated here really forms a pillar for, and what we hope is a best practice between Australia and Singapore, and really looking forward to that engagement across the broader ASEAN region, so that Australian businesses can really start to take advantage of some of those things that Phil was speaking about before, and remove some of the obstacles, and also allow some of us to bring some greater IP and sort of things that are up the value chain into these markets. So I'll leave it there and pass back to Michael, and thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Ben. It's very interesting to see a bit of the background there to this Australia-Singapore digital agreement, and it's again good that we have Ben here, who was actually involved in some of those discussions between government and industry. So we have our third question now, poll question, which is what would make you, or what makes you focus on the ASEAN region? And we've got 4 ideas and thoughts here: the customer base, the financial returns as a gateway to other markets, or its proximity to Australia. Now, there are many others, but we thought these were 4 interesting reasons why people might be focusing on ASEAN. So give you a a few 10 or 15 seconds to just give us an answer. Thank you. Okay, and well, there we are. Gateway to other markets is obviously an important focus for people, and its proximity to Australia. Very good. Thank you very much. It's interesting insight there. So our last speaker for the session is Tsen, who is the Deputy Chair of FinTech Australia and FinTech Investor Evangelist. He is, we're very, very pleased to be able to have Alan with us today to talk from the FinTech point of view, the opportunities into ASEAN for Australia. And again, a good follow on and segue from Ben's comments. So over to you, Alan.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks to the EastWest team for inviting me along today to speak. So what I thought I would do today is, if I can get this just to move, is to take one big step back and talk about some trends we're seeing in the region. And then very specifically just wanted to talk about one trend that I call everything's FinTech. And then talk about some of the opportunities that sit around that and why that's becoming a thing in this region. It's you know, globally probably a trend worth keeping an eye out for, but particularly in the region, we're starting to see this trend come to life. So let me dig in and I'll explain what the phrase "everything is FinTech" refers to. So yeah, just a little bit about me. I'm an early stage investor in FinTech startups. So also sit on the board of FinTech Australia and do some other stuff as well in the FinTech space. Cool. So I thought I'd talk about this trend, everything's FinTech. Now, before I dive into sort of why in ASEAN as a region this is becoming a thing, I'll give you a bit of context to what I mean when I say everything's FinTech. So let's take, again, sort of one giant step back and sort of think about, you know, how businesses make money, right? So historically, there are two ways that a B2C company makes money, right? One is obvious, it's direct, right? You charge your customer a transaction fee or a subscription fee for their service, right? Pretty obvious. And then what we've tended to see as more things go online is that there are now alternative ways to sell. So the other thing that obviously we're all pretty aware of, and we use Google on a daily basis, is advertising, right? And closely coupled with that, we've seen the rise, obviously, of data being sold about our activities online and just general information about ourselves. And this is generally the other way B2C companies make money. Now, what we're tending to see, and sort of this is the big interesting piece to this, is that financial services can now be sold by companies you generally actually wouldn't probably think would sell financial services. Now, it's usually at this point in the presentation when people say to me, "But Alan, that's not really that new, is it?" You know, I think I've been to Myer, and doesn't Myer like have its own credit card, or doesn't, you know, company X sell insurance? Isn't the sale of financial service product something that's happened for a really long time by companies that aren't necessarily financial services companies? Well, correct. Don't disagree with that. But I think the big difference now, and what we're seeing, is this idea that basically anyone can now start to sell financial service product, and they can do that a lot earlier in their life cycle as a business. And really what's powering that is this change in financial infrastructure, right? So one of the big trends that you know, I tend to talk about and companies that I look for in the financial infrastructure space, what we've seen is actually a massive change in the way financial services infrastructure is sold. So historically, if I was to say to you, you know, whatever your company is, would you think about selling financial service product? Your answer would be, no, I'm not a bank. That's probably really hard to do. Well, now we're starting to see actually it's becoming magnitudes of order easier to do that. And I've just put up a few different areas of financial infrastructure that become magnitudes of order more accessible to companies. So one simple example is insurance, right? So now every company can pretty much sell insurance, right? And we're starting to see companies like Cover Genius and Extend do that. So just with one line of code, and in some instances, not even a line of code, it's just simply subscribing to their service, you can start to offer extended warranties, right? It's a really simple example. And then, as we work our way down, we're starting to see companies that allow you to do lending directly on your platform. So there are companies like the ones I've listed here. And then all the way down to offering a full-blown banking service. And we call that, I've got that listed as BAS, that's banking as a service, right? So you can now run your own infrastructure. Well, you can run someone else's infrastructure and set up your own bank for all intents and purposes. You can issue cards, you can start to take deposits, which is a massive change from where we were, just even 5 years ago. And one important thing is, just coming back to this digital part, is that what we're tending to also see is the scale of the opportunity is morphing with the types of businesses that are becoming large. So if we to look at the financial outcomes for some companies last year and what portion of their business is represented by financial services, you can see I've just got a few examples here. Walmart's only 1%. For Macy's, the big box retailer in the US, high street retailer, it's about 3% of their business. Whereas for a company like Shopify, which is an e-commerce platform, in case you haven't heard of it, it's about 40%. And most of that is actually with respect to them charging or making revenue on the back of transaction fees, right? So if you look at their website, you see, you look at it and go, well, isn't this just an e-commerce platform that allows me to set up a e-commerce website? Well, yes, but really where they're making money, and this is the key pivotal part, is off the back of transactional revenue, right? It's actually 40% of their total revenue, which is pretty astounding when you dig into their financials. Great, that's an interesting story, Alan, but so what? What has this got to do with the conversation we're having today around ASEAN? Well, interestingly, this is a trend we're starting to see globally, and it's becoming more pervasive in terms of the types of companies that are offering financial services. And I actually predict that we'll see a lot of companies morph into fintech companies on the back of that. But it's a trend we've seen here in Asia, or specifically ASEAN, for quite a while. And we only need to look at a few really notable examples like Grab, Tsen, and Alibaba, obviously Chinese companies, but have a big reach into the ASEAN region. And Grab's a classic example of this, right? So if you know Grab, they started in ride hailing, ride sharing services, and have extended way out into providing all kinds of different financial services. And again, the key thing they found was, we've got a whole bunch of customers that could use financial services products. And this could be a significant new revenue stream for us. How do we do that? And again, part of what's powered that or allowed that to happen is this infrastructure layer being more accessible to people. In the context of Australia, looking outbound into the region, we know for a fact that 80% of fintechs in Australia are B2B, so they sell to other organizations. They don't sell to customers directly, which is sometimes a thing that surprises a lot of people. I already start to see some payments companies stretch out into Asia. Numerous have, but one notable example is a company called Assembly Payments, and they're a Victorian-based company. And what they've done is partnered with a bank in Singapore to offer this kind of embedded payments system for people that you usually wouldn't think would be wanting to generate revenue on the back of payments. And then on the inbound side, we're starting to see, I know personally I do, a number of companies coming to Australia trying to sell these kinds of financial services products into the market. So we're starting to see this back and forth in the region, and interest in this idea that anyone or any company can become a fintech company. And really the idea there is that financial services is now more accessible for a company to provide than ever before. And that's sort of the short version of it. It's something I talk to a lot of investors about, and it's sort of a trend that I think is worth watching, not only globally, but definitely in our region. Next time you use one of these apps that has a financial element to it, I think you'll be, hopefully on the back of this conversation, more aware of the types of things that companies can do. And again, I think if you are a company looking into the space, is really interesting. It's quite enlightening to sort of see the types of things you can now provide from a financial services perspective that are revenue accruing to you as a company. That's really all I wanted to talk about. I can easily be reached. You know, I'm sure the guys can give you my details. If you have any questions, drop them into the chat. More than happy to answer them. That's it. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks very much, Alan. A very, very interesting presentation, and very much to the point about particularly in terms of the digital transformation that we're seeing first in Singapore, and we expect that's going to drive through the ASEAN region. So we've got now some time for your Q&A, and we're very pleased if anyone has some questions or chat that you'd like to raise, please put in some comments now. Before we go to the Q&A, we've got our final poll question for you, and this relates again to most of our participants here who are interested in the ASEAN region. So what are some of the challenges that you found in doing business in the ASEAN region? And we've got lack of coordination, IP, lack of transparency, low financial returns, or there might be others. So please give us your thoughts for the next 10 seconds or so. Okay. And that's a very, very interesting comment, lack of coordination in markets. And we might wish to actually raise that with Phil in particular as we go into Q&A. And maybe some of our free trade agreements or even the RCEP agreement might well help to increase that coordination issue. But thank you very much for answering those questions. We really do appreciate it. So we've got some time now for Q&A, and I'd like to introduce Rajini Vasan, who is part of EWA's advisory group, and Raj is going to moderate our Q&A session. So thanks, Raj.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you to our expert panel of speakers for your absolutely wonderful insights into the relevance and the benefits of ASEAN to its citizens. I think it's very important to increase the ASEAN consciousness as a very critical part of the community building process. So it's a fantastic initiative today. I'll start with probably the most relevant question that's on everyone's mind, and that's obviously COVID. This is a question to all speakers. How do you think the post-COVID-19 or possibly the ongoing situation of COVID-19 will affect the ASEAN region, say in 2021, 2022 and beyond?
Shall I start?
Yeah.
ASEAN's had a reasonably good COVID compared with some other parts of the world. Vietnam, for example, did fabulously well. Probably Laos, Cambodia, certainly Brunei, Thailand had a good time. Indonesia and the Philippines are doing it a bit tough, although not tough by USA standards. But all of them are impacted by what's happening in the rest of the world, because most or all of the ASEAN countries are so outward looking that when there are problems in other parts of the world, it's a problem for them as well. For example, tourism is so incredibly important to Thailand. And of course, that's just been decimated in the last few months, and it's going to have a tough time for a little while yet. So in the region, because of COVID, instead of having our 5.5% growth this year, it'll probably be about -2, 1.5 to 2%, the economists tell me. And there'll be a sharp uptick next year, as there will in most countries around the world. So probably up 6 or 7% next year. But so the region is taking a hit. Those numbers on poverty and middle class and so forth will take a hit. But my optimism for the region relates to the long term. There will always be short-term hiccups. COVID has been one of the worst, but this too shall pass. and nothing about COVID, in my view, changes the favourable long-term outlook or the opportunity for Australian business in the region. Thanks, Raj.
Thank you, Philip. Ben, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, so I think one of the great things that I think you see in ASEAN is its adaptability, and I think that adaptability is allowed it to move and grow over such a long period of time. I think to Phil's point, where he was saying there was different impact on different areas and different countries in the region. So I've seen sort of firsthand, like in the Philippines, and this affects Australia directly. So the call center, Philippines runs a lot of call centers, and it supports a lot of major Australian businesses, and Telstra being one of them, and a lot of the major banks as well. So what we saw throughout COVID was basically the government shut down access to staff going to those buildings overnight, and that's why calling Telstra or calling some of these providers was instantly very difficult, as you saw sort of 10,000 call center staff suddenly unavailable. But what happened on the ground, I think, and what you've seen over time is the response to that, both from the individuals so willing and so keen to actually get things happening and navigate through and around those restrictions. And also you've seen sort of digitization and the like have a big impact as you've started to ship laptops and move the way call centers work and the like. So you sort of saw a lot of capacity actually come back online quite quickly, but you've also started to see in a very short amount of time the industries moving towards more digitization and start to pivot how they're serving those customers. So I think as we've seen in many instances in COVID, you've seen that a crisis really starts to expose how adaptable and resilient a place is. And I think you've seen pretty much across ASEAN some quite good responses there, which is why I think you're getting that very quick uplift back into GDP. But it also is why you've actually seen it impact less as governments of the like have been able to control the pandemic reasonably well compared to the rest of the globe.
Thank you, Ben. I think the questions are coming fast and furious. So whilst I try and get through those questions, one quick one for Philip. Could you tell us a little bit more, Philip, about AusCham ASEAN? What is it and what does it do?
Yeah, sure, Raj. So AusCham ASEAN is a chamber of chambers, if you like. It's each of the chambers in the 10 countries of ASEAN are foundation members of AusCham ASEAN, except Brunei, which doesn't have a Aussie chamber. It was launched by Malcolm Turnbull when he was Prime Minister in 2017. And the primary reason it was set up is that the ASEAN Secretariat and associated bodies declared that they will not deal with individual chambers in individual countries. They will only deal with a ASEAN-wide chamber accredited by them. So America, UK, EU, Australia, and a couple of others have formed ASEAN chambers. We felt that as ASEAN moves towards a more integrated single market, it was important that our chambers, our Aussie chambers, had some voice in support of our national interests and were able to convey our concerns and issues and constraints and so forth. So we advocate for Australian business interests. We facilitate working groups that are important to Australian industry. We inform, we explain, we advocate. And I think I would say if you'd like to get in touch with AusCham ASEAN to learn more, you can Google the website or you can go to EastWest Advisors and they'll steer you in the right direction.
Thank you, Philip. We have a question here. I believe it would be for Alan. Alan, the question is, Australia and the UK have built a fintech bridge. there have been recent discussions that a similar bridge may be organized between Australia and Singapore. So potentially, how do you think that will assist companies looking at entering each other's markets, if at all?
Yeah, so a little bit of context. The UK-Australia FinTech Bridge was really designed to facilitate companies being able to enter each other's markets. So the big difference between FinTech and a lot of other industries is that there are a bunch of regulatory hurdles when you're setting up a financial services company, as you can imagine. And so to that extent, anything that sort of eases that burden is a good thing. So that was sort of the thinking behind the FinTech Bridge. And so Australia has intent, and has for a while now actually, to extend those bridges into other jurisdictions. And the next one being Singapore, which totally makes sense, right? Given all the digital economy work that's being done between Australia and Singapore. So the answer is yes. The intent is that this helps. Practically though, having seen a few companies utilize the FinTech Bridge for the UK-Australia FinTech Bridge, it still requires a company to go and speak to a regulator. So it isn't automatic by virtue of the fact that you use the bridge that all of a sudden, you get dispensation to not meet the requirements under the law for the purposes of your financial services license, for example, in Australia. You still need to get that dispensation from a regulator. So it is convenient. It is a good first stepping stone, but there is still work to be done very practically for a company if they want to utilize it. And I imagine the same thing will happen with the Singapore one. There's quite a lot of overlay on it in terms of the regulatory work that needs to be done. And that's usually done at a regulator level. It's hard to match Australian law with, for example, Singapore law or UK law. They're relatively similar, that, obviously common law background. So that makes it a little bit easier. But yes, but there is work that you need to do if you want to utilize it.
I'll ask you a quick one, Alan, because I think it's a good question before we take perhaps the last one for all the three speakers here. What is your view on Hong Kong as a market, given the challenges that they are going through pre and obviously during COVID now?
Yeah, so the interesting thing on the data is this, which is that Hong Kong was, I think, fourth. I want to say fourth, definitely fourth last year in terms of jurisdictions that Australian companies look to on an outbound basis to move into. This is fintechs, obviously. We do a big census every year from FinTech Australia, and that's been pretty consistent. It's dropped a little this year. From memory, it might be fifth or somewhere there. But Hong Kong's been an interesting market, obviously a gateway into China, where people want to explore. I think there are challenges, obviously, with that, and more broadly in the region that sort of has been discussed today, being an outbounder from Australia. It's going to impact it, right? Like the reality is the challenges surrounding entering Hong Kong and obviously China are quite profound for a lot of companies, right? And understanding how to navigate that's going to be challenging. And I think when you overlay something like COVID on top of that, it makes it even more challenging. So I think it's going to present practical challenges for companies looking to move out into Hong Kong.
Thank you, Alan. Perhaps the last question, and my apologies, because we do seem to have a very engaged audience today, and Mike might elaborate on this, but we will put answers up for all these questions from our speakers if you would like to check the website later. So I'd like to finish on the question that I'm opening up to all speakers. Australian Connect opportunity. So the question is, what do you see as Australian businesses' largest barrier to entering into the ASEAN market? Their knowledge on the how-to, support in navigating the regional nuisances, comfort in regions they already know, or is there something else? We can start with perhaps Ben, Philip.
Yeah, I can kick off if you like. Yeah. So I think the sort of obstacles are, look, I think going into any new market, these obstacles, I think that what we tend to see as the obstacles for moving up into ASEAN, first and foremost, probably cultural, that they run a different structure. It is a different environment. So that can sort of scare off a fair few people. I think second to that would be that it is a number of, it's not one country, it's a number of countries, and all those countries are running their own their own legal systems, have their own nuances and the like. On the flip side of that, though, I think that is very much the opportunity. If it's the fact that it's not a uniform market means that there is a lot of opportunity to take knowledge from that Australian companies and Australia has, and really bring that into the region. And we've seen a lot of people in very varied sectors be successful in that. So from food and ag to tech to fintech and finance and the like. Where I'd say though that you know, even companies like Telstra, you know, what tends to happen is that a lot of the successes in Asia are not quite as well publicised in Australia as you'd think. So, I think Telstra is a good example. We actually run about 30% of the internet capacity for the Asia Pacific region. So that means for all countries in and out, be it Indonesia, be it Philippines, be it Vietnam, be it Singapore, 30% of that internet capacity is coming from Telstra-owned subsea cables, as one example. But I think that there's many partners as well, if you work and get to know the region, that can also help you navigate some of those things. And lastly, I'd just say, I think that's why Singapore is also a great gateway into the ASEAN region, as it's a very easy place to land. It's a quite simple place to do business, and it can really form a great centerpiece or great beachhead to learn more about the markets and get going. Phil?
So can I jump in? Ben said that very well, and I agree with everything he's just said. I'll just enlarge on a couple of things. Yes, the cultures are different in this part of the world. And what that means is Aussie companies that are thinking of investing in the region or becoming involved with the region must spend time to understand those cultures and time to build the relationships. And it's not the sort of thing that you can do on one trip to Singapore. The other point I'd make, and Ben, you mentioned that Telstra doesn't talk a lot about its success in Asia. I think you're right, that applies to a lot of companies in Australia. And I think it's a sad fact that shareholders in Australia and the media in Australia don't really reward Aussie companies for getting more involved in Asia. I think that's a shame, but I think it's probably a fact. I know that when banks and others announce they're withdrawing from the region, their shares go up. When they announce that they're expanding in the region, their shares go down. That doesn't strike me as logical, but I'm afraid it's kind of fact. So that's my input, Raj. Thank you. You're on mute, Raj.
Thank you very much. I think we've still got a lot of questions pouring in, so a warm thank you to our very engaged audience as well. Rest assured, we will pass on the questions to our speakers and make sure that the responses are available on our website. So please stay tuned, and I'll pass you back to Mike. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks very much, Raj. And again, thank you to all our panelists for their presentations on this webinar on what we think is a very important area. EastWest Advisors has focused on India, but it also has a focus on ASEAN, but also the India-ASEAN Connect as well. But we thank you very much for joining us today. This webinar has been recorded, and you'll be able to look at that recording through our website in the next couple of days. And as Raj said, we will make sure that the questions asked, we'll be able to provide answers again on our website. Again, thanks very much. And we look forward to being with you and talking with you at our next webinar from EastWest Advisors on Adapting to Succeed. And have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.